Okay, awesome. Welcome everybody. Uh, uh, thanks for coming tonight. It's great to see you all. We're excited you could join us. And special thanks to the Nebraska Arts Council and Nebraska Cultural Endowment whose support makes programs like these possible. My name's Peter. I'm the program director at Amplify Arts. For anybody who's new to Amplify, our mission is to support unity, progress, and innovation in the cultural sector. And Alternate Currents is one program that helps us do that by contextualizing national and international discussions in the arts with responses from people a little closer to home. So the program kind of foregrounds that objective in a few different ways. We have the Alternate Currents blog, which is an online resource. We have a bi-monthly discussion series, which we're all participating in tonight. And we also have a working group of 10 arts and culture workers who develop collaborative project-based work that kind of helps shapes the program and move it forward. So tonight's panel discussion on native land, land acknowledgements, and cultural institutions is the first in what will be a whole year of examining the future of our cultural institutions as they respond or fail to respond to calls for equity, justice, transparency, and accountability. Our panelists will be in conversation with one another for a little bit. After that, we'll open up the floor for your questions that you're welcome to enter into the Q&A. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you all know that a video of this discussion and a transcript will be posted to the Alternate Currents blog in the next week or so. You can revisit it there and leave your thoughts and comments in the comment section. And I also wanted to let you know that Amplify's Indigenous American Artist Support Grant submissions for that award are open now until February 14th. That's a $5,000 in unrestricted direct financial support for a creative practitioner working in any discipline living in Omaha who claims Native North Central or South American ancestry. So please visit our website to learn more about both Alternate Currents and our artist support grants. Our website, you can find our website at amplifyarts.org. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our panelists, our exceptional panelists, Marisa Miakonda Cummings, Risa Puleo, Steve Tamayo, and our wonderful moderator, Annika Johnson.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks for inviting me to be the moderator on this panel. I'm the Associate Curator of Native American Art at the Joslyn Art Museum. I'm really here as a listener and learner. I am so excited to listen to the three of you brilliant people talk about land acknowledgements and how we can make some transformative change. You know, I am a curator. I work in arts and culture institutions. It's been pretty remarkable to me, even in the last 4 years, just how frequently I now see land acknowledgements done at the beginning of programs usually. It's not mandated here in the US, but there is a definite interest. You know, it's by no means a common practice, but especially in arts and culture organizations and universities, this is happening. So I think there's a great interest in this topic, but I also think we have a lot to learn and a lot to discuss. So today I'm hoping to cover a broad range of issues. This conversation is pretty free flowing. We can take it where it needs to go. I think we'll cover some of the problematic aspects of land acknowledgements, as well as how reorienting ourselves in Indigenous spaces can lead to really positive and deep structural change. So with that, I'd like the three panelists to introduce yourselves and say a little bit about what a land acknowledgement means to you, what the land means to you. And I'd like to start off with Marisa Cummings. Thanks for being here, Marisa.
Thank you, Annika. I'll start with the introduction in my language. Greetings, thank you. It's a good day today, and I'm glad you're all here. Let me tell you who I am. Marisa Cummings. My name is Miakonda, a name given to me by my great grandmother Edith Walker Springer, which she carried the same name, and my English name is Marisa Cummings. Umaha wa ubli te sindu tuanga tawa ubli ishtasunda nikashindabli I am an Omaha woman, and I belong to the Buffalo Tail Clan of the Sky People. Ide Bite, Winnebago, Nebraska, Indian Health Service Hospital. I was born in what is now known as Winnebago, Nebraska, at the Indian Health Service Hospital. I come from a large family. I come from the Walker and Springer families of the Omaha people. My mother was a German American third generation settler. And when we discuss what the land means to me, she's my mother. The land, the earth is made up of the remnants of our people. It's made up of the soil that nurtures our seeds that we carry. Some of us still carrying those traditional indigenous seeds. And it's this idea of land ownership versus being a steward and a caretaker of the land. So all of this winds up to being a good relative, a good ancestor to all living and non-living relatives, and acknowledging the spirits that exist in the land, the water, the sky, in all of those realms, and being connected to them. So it's really about connection to creation. That's all I have to say. Weeblaha.
Risa, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. My name is Risa Puleo. I am zooming in from Chicago, which let's do this. Acknowledge is on a city built on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy. The Ojibwe, Ottawa, and the Potawatomi is also home to the Miami, Illinois, Annika, Ho-Chunk, and Menominees. Owing to its location on Lake Michigan, as well as its proximity to the many rivers in the area, this land was a traditional meeting place for many tribes and communities, is now home to one of the largest and most diverse Native urban communities in the U.S. I'm a guest in this land. I am actually from San Antonio, Texas. And when I talk about being from San Antonio, Texas, I mean, I am from that land. My ancestors were from that place before it was named San Antonio by the Spanish. We are descended from the Guajitecan people, from whom the word Texas is derived. Texas, at some point the Tecan became a Texas and is now in Texas. So these are the people who now give that land this name, and yet I believe only one or two people still speak that language. I believe that I'm here because I am the person who is maybe responsible for the land acknowledgement that is posted outside Bemis Center for Contemporary Arts. Inside their entry door, I put up that land acknowledgement with the help of a young Omaha woman who did the research to write that, and then we crafted the language together. That opportunity to put the land acknowledgement came up for an exhibition that I did in 2017 at Bemis called Monarchs, Brown and Native Artists in the Path of the Butterfly. And that was an exhibition that used the butterfly, I hate to say use, that was inspired by the butterfly and tried to think like a butterfly, to imagine how we could begin to imagine what rethinking the land without all of these boundaries that had been established by treaty laws, like all these state boundaries, including the boundaries between US and Canada and the United States and Mexico. That's the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The butterfly is indifferent to these boundaries. And so how could we think about this land as being continuous again? This was an exhibition that was also trying to contextualize itself within recent events. And if you're remembering 2017, that was on one hand, the Standing Rock protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline. And then on the other, a presidential campaign that was built on a promise to build a wall at the US-Mexico border. So this is interesting because I'm going to state a position. Oh, also, I want to ask you to notice this shirt that I'm wearing. It was made by a Chicago artist named Santiago X. It says rematriate the land, and you too can have one here through that link. So this is an interesting position to be. I recently got an email from the director of BEMAS asking if he would mind if he used the land acknowledgement as proof of BEMAS's communities to Native communities. BEMAS owes me money for that exhibition that they never paid. And I would also like to say BEMAS gets a lot of funding from funders invested in oil and cattle who are actively in detriment to the land. So there's this way in which I didn't recognize at the time I was participating in a sort of performative use of the land acknowledgement, which isn't also to say that land acknowledgements don't have an important function within institutional spaces. It was also interesting because that exhibition traveled to Miami, to San Antonio, to Overland Park in Kansas, just outside of Kansas City, and it was supposed to travel to Minneapolis after a number of incidents at the Walker. So what was really also interesting about this migration of the show was the very different responses to land acknowledgements based on who was writing them in those places and also the constituency of those places. And I will also say that at a certain point, we even got pushback about writing a land acknowledgement for the show from the Native community who said, this is not for us. We know that this is our land. This is for like a settler viewer. So this is, I'm giving you all of these anecdotes now to just kind of throw some complications in from the beginning about land acknowledgements that I hope we can think about.
Thank you, Risa, and welcome, Steve.
So good evening, everybody. My name's Steve Tamayo. I'm a member of the Sicangu Lakota from Rosebud, South Dakota. And so, you know, this land acknowledgement, when I first heard that term, you know, it takes me back to many generations, to both sides of my family because of my last name being Tamayo, you know, and my grandparents coming from Monterrey and Montemores, you know, way down in Mexico. And so, but being a member of the Sicangu Lakota, you know, it's very specific to my indigenous roots. And so when I think about land acknowledgement, you know, I claim the Western Hemisphere. And so not only that, but it extends over across the pond because of the influence of trade. And so when the fur traders made their ways down the rivers, you know, unfortunately, they ended up with a lot of our women. And so because of that, you know, my grandmother, who is of the Ihontoa, the Yankton Sioux tribe, you know, she carries that last name of Archambault. And so even on my grandfather's side, you know, he carries that name of Bachmann, you know, from German descent. And so I have all kinds of mixed blood, you know, that runs through my veins still today that, you know, when I think about this land acknowledgement, you know, I think about what specific time are we actually referring to? And so as Lakotas, you know, one thing that most people aren't aware of is our language, our customs, our traditions, you know, were against the law. And so this land acknowledgement was about forced removal of our homelands, of our ancestral homelands. And so, you know, I am very happy and proud that I'm a member of the Sicangu Lakota. And with that being said, Hamataki, Petikile, Machanteta Wogla, Ke Hanape Chuzapalo, and Macha Sicangu Lakota, Echela Tiwahe Ta Sampe Oyanke. And so this is one of our greetings. And so in my language, you know, I come to this Zoom meeting with a good heart, you know. And so a lot of times when I work in the school systems as a cultural specialist for Omaha Public Schools, you know, I have to be mindful of my audience. And how age appropriate can I gift them with this cultural knowledge. And so once again, working with the pre-K all the way up into our high schools and then teaching for Metropolitan Community College as well as UNO, it gives me the opportunity to tell our stories at many different levels. And so understanding that, tonight we can actually speak the truth. And so, when I work with my kids, when I work with the teachers in the OPS school system, when they teach about history, US history, that's not our history. And so we incorporate the absent narrative. We incorporate our stories of creation and how we have evolved from the Wichakville Oyateke, from the Star Nation people. And so when you read and research and learn about, the indigenous relatives of Turtle Island, of a place we call Kiamakoche, we incorporate our creation stories of emerging from the underworld. And so understanding that, and how we were placed here, and how our Nagila, our soul, our Wanagi, when it goes back up to the creator, and when those stars fall, this is how we come back home. And so that's that continuous cycle that never ends. And so they try to bury us time and time again. And when I say them, I talk about the government. I talk about backing from the United States military. And so, trying to contain us, control us, is something that they still haven't been able to do. And so, we know of the millions of indigenous people who used to reside on the Western Hemisphere. And so today, there's only a few million of us left. And so, but those numbers, there was only 200,000 or so when they first took that census in 1890 of the indigenous people. And so what happened to our relatives? And so, we're trying to revive, we're trying to bring back our stories, our language, and trying to preserve as much as possible. But we've lost so much, and so, but this is what we're trying to reclaim. And so this process of reclaiming and understand this land acknowledgement, this is indigenous land. And so I look at it as the Western Hemisphere, as indigenous land. All of my relatives to the south, that ethnic group that exists today as Mexicans was a population, was a group of people that was created because of the indigenous people that were there and when the Spaniards came over. And so that's how and why the Mexican people were created. And so in the OPS school system, everybody from the South automatically, bam, the teachers think, they must speak Spanish. They don't understand that they're Guatemalan and Nicaraguan and El Salvadorian, and all the different ethnic groups and languages that exist. And so I bring an awareness to the 7,000 languages that exist in the world. And so being able to be a part of that, because I grew up as a Mexican. And so understanding, Spanish very fluently as a little person. And then that was kind of beat out of me. It was taken away from me because I had such a hard time in school. And so, I kind of forgot my Spanish. And then as an adult, I wanted to learn more about my mother's side, my family up in South Dakota. And so, it's common for people to leave the comfort of their home, the comfort of their community, to go and learn and go to different universities. And so that's what I did. But my university was a way of life. And so that's why I moved to Rosebud, South Dakota, to learn the ways of being a Lakota. And so this is a way of being, and that's how important that is. So that land acknowledgement, once again, what time period? In the 1500s, we were in the Carolinas, and then we systematically migrated up towards the Great Lakes area. And then we headed westwards. Once again, we got caught in a prairie fire. So when you do research of indigenous people, the explanation, the names that identify them will explain what happened to the people in their movement. And so I'm a Sichongu. I'm a member of the Burnt Thigh people because of this prairie fire that occurred in 1762-63. Lakota is the dialect in which I speak. And so in the history books, you read about Sioux Indians, but we don't call ourselves Sioux Indians. That Nadiawasu means something else. It's not who we are. And so I am a Lakota. That's the dialect in which I speak, a member of the Sichangu Lakota. And then once again, you know, my family comes from from a small little beautiful community called Milks Camp. And so you'll probably never find Milks Camp on a map. And so we're way out in the country by ourselves, which is really awesome. We're not on the main square that we call Rosebud today. And so I am in, my community is in between Rosebud and the Yankton Sioux Reservation, way down in the creeks. And so once again, you know, there's no maps, no acknowledgement of our ways, you know, where our community is. And it's kind of cool that way. And we often tell people, you know, even on our own reservation, they've never been to Milks Camp community. And we're like, that's our secret. We haven't let that out yet. So hopefully one day, each and every one of you could visit my community because it is a beautiful place. And so my land acknowledgement is today of Ta'asampe Oyanke, which is Milks Camp community. And this is where all of my ancestors are buried at today. So Pilami Apala, thank you.
You three are amazing. And I wrote down so many questions and ideas and comments. My first question was, what's the purpose of a land acknowledgement? But I'm totally scrapping that because Marisa, you're talking about earth. And when we're talking about land, we're talking about the earth. Risa, you mentioned, you know, well, who is this land acknowledgement even for? Steve, you're talking about a land acknowledgement as a way of being. Like, this is much more expansive than this sort of discrete institutional statement that I think is how land acknowledgements are being talked about right now, at least within the arts and culture field. I get a sense of this sort of anxiety around having to perform an acknowledgement. So I think maybe a good place to start then is, what is the work that needs to be done?
And could I just jump in quick right before that? I want to give a brief history of where this contemporary idea of land acknowledgement comes from.
Thanks.
And there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was led out of Canada, and Senator Marie Sinclair was, can you all hear me okay? I know somebody said, okay.
It's really faint.
It is?
Yeah.
You're good for me.
Yeah, I think some people say it's faint and some people say it's okay. So see if you can turn up your volume, Steve, if that helps.
I did.
Okay. All right. Sorry. I'll try and talk really loud.
I'm an old man, so.
So, you know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Marie Sinclair is our Western Doorway Chief in our Medewin Lodge, the Three Fires Medewin Lodge. And he was a judge that became a senator. And him and his wife, you know, assisted and led the storytelling. They went to every single Indigenous community. And I want to be careful with that word Indigenous too. But every single Indigenous community in Canada. And they collected stories of those communities and how the Canadian government impacted those communities in a harmful way. And along with that came this, you know, huge collection of ideas on how the reparation of this relationship between Canadians, First Nations people and the government could happen. And part of that was that they wanted acknowledgements of treaty land. So it's a little different up there how they do those, like Treaty 1, Treaty 2 territories. But they wanted wherever federal, I guess, administrative folks went, for them to acknowledge the Indigenous people whose land that they were on. The difference is, in Canada, they did not have the movement and they did not have the removal to the extent that we did here in the US. And so what was happening, and so anyways, the point being that it was a Canadian theme that was brought to America. And I get it, like, hey, it's a great idea. We want to be acknowledged, right? The city of Omaha, that's named after us. Hey, you know, like, let's acknowledge that. Let's say it right. Let's pronunciate it right. Let's realize the tribe's right up the road, you know, let's acknowledge those people that live there. But then we get into this thing where we're called the Omaha tribe of Nebraska through the BIA naming us. right? The Omaha tribe of Nebraska. Nebraska didn't even exist when we signed our treaty. The only way Nebraska became a state is through the removal of other people, Ponca, Pawnee, Northern Cheyenne, and others, right? And through that removal, and we were able to stay, luckily, in somewhat of a territory that we knew, but that was even a territory new to us in the last 200 years, because as that expansion happened from the East Coast, everybody, it was just a time of chaos. Tribes were moving all over. There was warfare, there was, hunger shortages, where we're used to having these huge agricultural surpluses that we were trading on, which Steve spoke of before. Our people went all the way up to Winnipeg, what's now called Winnipeg, to trade buffalo hides before. We were traveling all over the place, and our network wasn't roads, it was the rivers. And so this time of confusion was happening. And then what we're taking on, what we're naming places and spaces all have, 90% of these towns have Indian names. And, I'm in Minneapolis right now, Minneapolis area. And you drive around, there's Wakanda, South Dakota, which is our name for the creator, or for, I would say, creation. And so, our names, our words were taken from us, our seeds were taken from us, our patriarchy was enforced, our women's rights and way of life were taken from us, our children were taken from us. And now it's like, oh, well, we're going to say that the city of Omaha is on the traditional land of the Omaha tribe. And well, what else is coming with this? Where's the reparation part? What are you going to do to remedy the violence that has been done to our people, the harm that is still living through our veins to this day? What are you going to do to fix that before you talk about acknowledging stolen land? And that's why I'm careful about the word indigenous, because if we go over to anywhere in the world, somebody's indigenous, right? You're indigenous. There's indigenous people to what's now called Scotland, England. You get into the Yorks and all the different, groups of people that lived over there. So the word indigenous is a word that we have to be very careful with. Although I like to use it instead of Native American or American Indian, it's kind of a word I prefer, because we are the original people of this land. And the reality is that we were here before America, and we're going to be here after America, because our connection is that deep into the underwater springs, into the land that houses the bones of our ancestors, into our children that are learning our way of life, that are renewing, because this is the first generation that has been able to grow up without fear of violence for singing our songs and practicing our way of life. And so I think about this being like so much more than that, but I wanted to talk briefly about where this idea came from and why it's different here in the States than it is in Canada, and why it is and can be performative, although the intentions may be super awesome. I have seen, when I was in Pittsburgh, I heard a land recognition talking about honoring the Osage people. The Osage people whose land we're on right now. Pittsburgh? Like, I'm pretty sure that there's a group right up the road that's still here. And not to say that the Osage may not have been over there way long time ago, because they're part of the Diggy-How, they're part of our group, right? But there's a group of people right up the road who you didn't acknowledge. And so it's been done wrong so many times. It's been done half-assed so many times. And then a lot of white people like to get Indians that are easy to talk to, I'll put it like that, not me, on these boards and committees to make land acknowledgements, because they tell them what they want to hear and they make it sound pretty and they make it easy for them. So I'm going to be quiet.
Thanks for giving that brief history. I think that's really important for all of us to know. And what I'm going to pick up on here is the word reparations. And you also are talking about discussion, a land acknowledgement. There is a website you can go to. I forget the exact URL, but it's like a map of, different tribes, and it shows where the overlap is, and you can type in your city, or there's like a text service where you can, send a text, write your city, and it'll pop back with some tribe names, and I've found that it's often inaccurate. So maybe as a step to this process of deeper change, what do conversations look like around this? What is this process of understanding? I think there's a lot of unlearning that needs to be done, a lot of learning that needs to be done. I know this is a very broad question, but how does conversation fit into this when we're talking about such complex layers of movements of people, of different government to government relations, of genocide? I mean, there's just multiple historical layers here. I'll open it up. Or maybe I'll ask. Oh, go ahead, Steve.
Okay, so, when you talk about that, this topic's just so open, you know what I mean? Because, what time period, once again, because, as Lakotas, we lived north of Oglala, and so there's a place called Blue Water Creek, and that was like our main stomping grounds back in the day, But back in the day, I'm talking, American Horse, Red Cloud, a lot of our Itachas that way, And so, one thing about OPS and working with our social studies teachers, our history teachers, I get to incorporate our words and try to do away with the wrong words. And so we have no chiefs, this concept of chiefs never existed. We had councils of men. And so you would be an Itacha of your own Teoshpai, your own little village, And so we couldn't live in like big cities because of pollution. And so, all of our horses would eat up all the grass. We would contaminate the ground. We were on constant movement. Once again, not just this migration, but more of a systematic migration because of seasons, because of game, because of firewood and water. And so, this is why our land mass was just huge, And so our lands back in the day was controlled by landmarks. And so rivers and forests and mountains, they kind of determined our ancestral homelands at that time. And so when you talk about repatriation, what time period, once again, And so is it first contact? Is it, is it during, that time of the 1860s where the Indian Wars took off, And when they were done fighting with each other during the Civil War, and that tide went out westward, And so that's when we fought with them. But in our history books, once again, in when you're third and fourth grade, kids, we're just like, oh my gosh, we killed all the Indians. And so they're still surprised today that when we come up, and we start speaking our language, and they're like, what, you still exist, And so they see these items in the museums of yesteryear. And so as an artisan, as a traditional artisan, I love to create art still out of items that I create and that I find outside. And so that's just how I am. But, once again, to revitalize these old cultural teachings is kind of my mission in life. And so that's what's really cool about this. And I have a nice following of young adults, in our high schools that are really passionate about this. And so understanding their existence and their tribal nations and where they come from, I have them do the research of their own people. And that's how important that is. And so as a traditional artist, of course, we're going to use that rawhide, that skin, but the symbology and the numerology, the color concepts you incorporate will differentiate what tribal nation you come from or what region you come from. And so, we are the people of the plains. And so, you know, even that horse and being on that stoic horse, having that look, you know, and that headdress, you know, and our sage, you know, our staff, you know, this is what I teach. And so the paraphernalia that exists with each of our warrior societies, each of our women's guilds and their societies themselves will determine, once again, their existence and their way of being. And that's how important this is. And so we know, you know, I love the land acknowledgement because I'm indigenous to this land. I've been here for thousands of years. And so when I say I'm talking about all of my ancestors, you know, to always remember our ancestors. And so understanding the importance of that land back is just a farce. That's something that we will never get our land back. And so, you know, even when we took them to court and we won that settlement, we won that trial, that case of the Black Hills, of that illegally confiscating the Black Hills. And so going back once again to those treaties back at that time period, we were awarded millions of dollars. And today that money is still in the bank. That money is at $1.3 billion. And yet we are still some of the poorest indigenous nations in this land. And yet we're just like, we don't want the money, we want the land. But look where the Black Hills is. And look at the tourists that go from all over the world to the Black Hills. And so we'll never, ever get that land back. And so, you know, I'm a water protector. And so as a water protector, I create art to bring an awareness of the environmental atrocities committed by these fossil fuel companies. And so understanding that and the impact of climate change and how it's played a part in all of our lives. And once again, still trying to contaminate our lands, but not only our lands, everybody's land. And so you have to think about that, like the Oglala Aquifer that runs from Canada all the way to Texas. And once you contaminate our water supply, then what are the 10 to 15 million people going to do? Then there'll be an outcry. And so this is why it was so important 4 years ago for us to gather as many different nations at Standing Rock to bring an awareness. And so I knew that time was real when the Crow Nation came walking in. I'm just like, oh, I about fell over. And so I was asked to participate and go to Standing Rock. And so I became the art teacher for a very special school called Miniwichoni Nakichizi Owayo. And this is the Defenders of the Water School. And so I was at Standing Rock for a long time as an art teacher. And so I had my Lekshi time. And so once again, that's what the kids came up with. They came up with the name of the school. They came up with Lekshi time. So Lekshi is uncle. So it's Uncle Steve's time. And so I'm just like, this is freaking. So, you know, it's like I prepared my whole life for that movement, that standoff. And so, you know, once again, when you think about repatriation, you know, how is that even possible? And so
kind of respond to this. And
thank you.
by thinking a little bit like the land in terms of geological time instead of historical time. There hasn't been an empire in the history of the world that has lasted. Rome fell, Greece fell, and what we're talking about is occupancy by the United States. That also will have an end date. And the land will still be here. So I'm trying to like just shift our sense of scale and time around this statement that you're saying that I'm going to say rematriation for Santiago X. Rematriation, returning to the mother, is not possible. Because when we're also talking about patriarchy, what we're talking about also is the kind of the structures and logics of the United States or the nation state as a construct. So I think that it may not be within our lifetime, we might not experience it, but I do think that there will be a moment where the United States is no longer. There's also this interesting kind of like question that I think that kind of Marisa, please correct me, Marisa, if I'm wrong, is kind of seeping in about the difference between indigenous, being of this place, being from this place, being born of the earth, that your ancestors are buried in, being turned back into the earth, that your ancestors are, that you will be buried in as well. And being nativist, and these sort of like increasing calls, like political calls about like who belongs to this place. It was really interesting, Marisa, when you were talking, something you were saying reminded me of this like real like frontier settler Texan statement that gets said a lot, which is Texas was his own country and we will be again. And my response to this is like, yeah, it'll be an indigenous land again, as a sort of way to think about the kind of many different occupancies that have allowed different groups to make claim to ownership or placedness or being from a place, in a way that I think that what we're talking about is different. And so the ways in which like treaty boundaries have moved the Omaha to Nebraska or made Texans indigenous, or in the ways that all of these things kind of become like a jumble.
Yeah, I just want to speak to that. So like I could say that, you know, I own the sky, right? Or I could say I'm the princess of England if I want to. It doesn't mean if it's true. And so this idea of ownership is something when it was applied during, you know, pre-colonial times, you know, it had to be done in a very structured way. And I don't want to go all the way into federal Indian policy, but when we look at like for instance, the Papal Bulls, and, you know, saying that, you know, indigenous people did not have right to ownership of land, but only occupancy of land. And if they denied, you know, Christianizing themselves, they could be enslaved, raped, or murdered. I mean, it's in the Papal Bulls. The Pope wrote it, not me. I always get people that want to battle me on it. I'm not for that. Go research it yourself. But that's what the Pope said. And in those papal bulls, that became federal Indian law here in the United States through the Marshall Trilogy. And so it was enforced through our own Supreme Court that Indian people don't have right to, and that even goes to our reservations. Like there's whole kinds of issues with land that I won't get into, and with us not having true ownership or being able to get capital on our own land. But the idea that Minneapolis, or where I live right now, I don't own this land, which I don't get the own thing, but I offer tobacco in my backyard. I offer tobacco in my front yard. Our kiddos take our spirit plates out to the trees that are all around our house. That to me is our way of honoring the spirit of creation and the spirits of our ancestors. And so in our home, we're practicing this. This is how we live our lives. And so when I think of a land acknowledgement, you know, acknowledging our mother, because land is your mother, there's no, you know, Hatande, right? There's no, we don't say Turtle Island because that's kind of more of a, like Algonquin, Haudenosaunee, creation story. But she's our mother. And then you have our grandmother, the moon, right? You have our father, the sun. And so these, what people would call deities, but what we call relatives, right? Or what people would call resources, but we call relatives, you know? And so I think it's just a whole different way of thinking and being that you know, it doesn't matter if they call it Minneapolis today, you know, somewhere we are witnessing, this is in our prophecies, what we're going through right now in the United States. You know, I created this meme on Facebook where it's like Kermit drinking tea and I put a cedar leaf on it. And I'm like, just sitting here drinking my cedar tea, watching the prophecies unfold, because these are the teachings what we're given in our lodge at this time would come. I didn't think it'd come for, you know, I was preparing my kids for their kids, for their kids, for their kids. But we're watching it start. And so when these, you know, even my kids will be like, Mom, is it happening? Like they can even sense it. You know, we're all sensing this shift in energy. And we're watching this country kind of implode right now, because the foundation of this country was built on white supremacy, and it was built on oppression, and it was built off stolen people and stolen land. And that land wasn't just stolen. People were killed violently. You know, people were murdered violently. And you can say, well, Indians were killing themselves before we got here, but that's not really what was happening. And so that might be some white history book that tells people those stories of our history, but nobody's asked us what was happening, you know, pre-contact, because we'll tell you stories of like the Three Fires Confederacy. We actually had an agreement with them. So we signed the Treaty of Prairie du Chien in 1831, the Fourth Treaty of Prairie du Chien, and we aligned ourselves with the Three Fires Confederacy at that time. And so there's these long histories of connection and interaction among tribes. And then there's times we didn't get along, you know, and we would have it out. And then we'd get together and have, you know, a feast and ceremony, and okay, we're good again. And in those times of peace, our women were the ones that rose to the top, because we were the ones that were making the food, creating the food, sowing the food in the land, right? And then in times of war, patriarchy kind of came up, because men are the warriors. So it was kind of this balance that would fluctuate, and we're always looking for that balance. But what happened, I think, is because we were in this time of warfare and then colonization kind of at the same time, we got stuck in this patriarchy. And so we really wanted to like adjust to this, and we were forced to adjust to European forms of patriarchy, like in, for instance, the Dawes Act, right? And allotment was completely patriarchal. Male head of household, male owned the woman, male owned the children. That came from Europe. That did not come from here. Our women own the home, our women own the children, and our women, this is her space, right? And our men acknowledge that and respect that, because they respect us, or they should, or else they get kicked out. So that's, Steve knows, you know that story, put your moccasins outside, that means you don't come home. If your shoes are outside, this isn't your home anymore, you know? And so it's a whole different way of our thinking. And sometimes we try and put this colonial Western European way of thinking, and we try and make an equal sign and then say Indian, this is what it equals. And in reality, even in our language, it's not equal. It's different ways of thinking. And part of what we're doing now in this time and place and space is we're trying to change the way that we're thinking and think more like those old people thought. And it's hard as heck when we're bombarded with all of these ideas of things and, you know, capitalism and beautiful houses and cars and clothes, and it's hard. But that idea of capitalism and excess is what's killing our earth. And so minimalism is actually something that we have to look at embracing more, because that means that we're protecting her more. And so it's just a different way of thinking. And I love, Steve, when you talked about going to Standing Rock, that was a time in our current recent history that changed everything for us. It brought us together. It connected us to people who thought like us. We're like, oh, okay. I'm like, okay, I'm not crazy. There are other people out there that are thinking like me, you know? And Steve made me a really beautiful picture that was a water protector picture. So I really think he's an amazing artist, and he does a lot for the community. So teaching all the Omahas, and he even learned some Omaha to teach those little Omahas. So I appreciate him. But I just wanted to say that much, and I'll stop.
Oh.
I think this is wonderful. And I just want to remind the listeners, if you have questions, start typing them into the Q&A, because I do want to get to some of your questions, and we might go over a little bit, but type them into the Q&A function. But I did want to bring up, while people are formulating those questions, language has come up a lot. I mean, Marisa, what you were just talking about is this problem of translation. Like, it's not a deity, like that idea, you know, missionaries came in, and when they were trying to understand, they weren't understanding, but when they were trying to at least document Indigenous life ways, they were trying to draw this correlation to a Christian way of structuring the world. So I'm curious to hear what the three of you think about in relation to rematriation, land back movements, how Indigenous languages factor into this. And I can think of one example in Minnesota, I'm from Minnesota, of Bide Makaska, Lake formerly known as Lake Calhoun, but formerly known as Bide-Makaska, that is now formally recognized by the city and the state for its Dakota name. I feel, you know, as somebody who grew up going to that lake, that was a really profound moment for me. But I'm wondering what the three of you think. How does language factor into acknowledging land?
Let's just point out quickly that Fort Calhoun, that's by Omaha, Nebraska, is named after the same Calhoun. So he fought on the wrong side of the Civil War. He believed in slavery. He was an Indian killer. And the forts are named after people like that, of course. And so Fort Calhoun is named after that exact same person. So I just want to point that out for all you people that live in what's now called Nebraska.
You know, for those of you who don't know, half of the states in the US have indigenous origins to them. And so even, you know, where Marisa's at, you know, understanding Mini is that water, Jalasota is that mist. And so just like Ni Shude, understanding that misty waters, the smoky waters. And so it's what we see. And so I always tell everybody, you know, especially when I go back to the Carolinas, I used to visit that place every few years. And so understanding that there's a lot of the rivers and the mountains with really long names, because it's evidence of the people that used to live there, that no longer live there, because of forced migration, because of extermination. And so, you know, when you look at place, once again, when you look at the mountains and the rivers, think about, you know, that name specific and how they identify that. And so anytime you hear that Bide, Mini, Ni, this is all water. And that's how important that is. And so quite often, you know, I give a talk about what is truly sacred. And so once again, utilizing English, it takes away a lot of the true heartfelt meanings of our words. And so there's a lot of our words that can never, ever be translated. And so understanding, like as simple as mitakoye, oyase, that we're all related. And so with that the mainstream thought process, you just think that, oh, you know, they're talking about their own, you know, themselves as indigenous people, you know, but it's more than that, because we are related to everything that exists. If it lives and breathes and it has that nagi, and so that nagi or that nagila is that soul. And so when it loses that physical body, then it becomes wanagi. It's separated. And so once again, there's a deeper meaning to our words. And so when I talk about stages of life, you know, as Lakota, we incorporate the 7 stages of life, of our ways of being, because we come here as a spirit. And then, you know, in the English, you know, mainstream, once again, you know, they have the same concept. They just call them toddlers and adolescents and teenagers and adults, you know, and so we have that same thing. But when we talk about and identify our beautiful females, our women, we incorporate la at the end, like we chichala, we unchala, and so we koshkalaka. And so understanding that la is that term of endearment, that heartfelt term of endearment that we have for that individual. But for our wians, it doesn't have a la on them, because we have to be mindful of our status amongst the people. And so think about that. And so we call it, you know, that jealousy is a factor. And so understanding that, you know, a lot of our men and a lot of our women are very jealous of each other. And so, but once you reach that next stage of grandma, they're like, oh, she's grandma. Then she becomes we unchala. And then she becomes, oh, you can come up and hug her and everything else, you know. But if she's just man, you better stand back and, don't even look at her, I know you're looking at her, but, but it's things like that. And so that's how powerful our words are. It's descriptive. It's just heartfelt, And so once again, we incorporate that into what we see. And what we see is our land, is our waters, is our mountains and our tree lines. And so this is how complicated our language is. And so even when you talk about an eagle, for us, it's more complicated than that, because we identify the stage of life that it's in. And what type, is it a spotted, is it immature, is it golden, is it a bald eagle, And so even utilizing those feathers, those are gifted to a lot of our indigenous people. And so understanding that, the golden eagle belongs to the men, that bald belongs to our females. And so there's a lot of teachings in this way of life. And so that's kind of where, I come into play. And so, I've been able to be gifted all of this cultural knowledge because I wanted to sit down with some grandmas and grandpas and just have some soup and have some coffee and just visit. And you'll be amazed of what you're gifted if you just go down and sit down and settle down and put away that technology and sit down and just visit and openly communicate. And so, for indigenous people, you have to be mindful once again, because if you come at us with questions, we're like, okay, and we have to take you back to a place like in the beginning. And then we'll never tell you because we don't think you're ready for that next stage. And that's how important and valuable our information is. And so once again, people have profited off of our indigenous teachings and our creation stories. And so when you read about all these, these books and movies and everything else, it wasn't written by indigenous people, because then it becomes fact. We're visionary people, and that's how important that is. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Thanks, all of you. I just want to keep talking to all of you. We do have a really active Q&A. I see Marisa and Risa, you've been commenting. Thanks for that. I see a lot of these questions as being really interconnected. Steve, to what you were saying, talking about the history and what history is taught versus what history you learn through building relationships. And somebody asked, with so much history and so many different groups, where do we start if we want to learn more and understand this important history of the land? And I want to tie that into another question, which is who can write/draft a land acknowledgement? So I think, there's a lot to tease out here in terms of just dialogue, communication, and relationship building. Risa, I know you've done this for institutions, you've done this as a curator. I'm curious to hear from the three of you your thoughts on that question of, who to go to. Where does the conversation begin?
Yeah, I just want to say one thing. I worked at the University of Iowa, the University of South Dakota, and when it came down to drafting the land acknowledgement at USD, it was part of that committee that would assign to that. And I, after having conversations with everyone, I just said I can't do it. I don't believe in them. I think that they cause more harm than they do good. And the reason for that is because of the intentionality behind it. Like I said, some people have great intentions. They have, or they assign someone with great intentions to lead a task force, lead a committee. And in reality, what comes out is not something that I feel honored by, or I feel respected by. And so I will not help anyone draft a land acknowledgement. So if the purpose of, sitting in on this Zoom call today was to find someone to do that, I'm not your person. But there's all kinds of Indians, and there's all kinds of Indians that do all kinds of things. And so maybe you'll find one that will be willing to do that. I also think that, academic institutions I want to touch on, being here in Minnesota, being in Iowa, I'm from Sioux City, Iowa, right? Nebraska, South Dakota, Iowa, tri-state area. And all of those land grant or state institutions of higher ed all participated in colonialism from the very beginning, right? So these institutions were built almost as soon as as statehood happened. In these institutions are our ceremonial objects, our people's bones. There was a building at Iowa that none of us Indians would go in because we're like, that's where they keep all, you know, all the Indians' bones are in the basement in there. So none of us would go in that building. And we actually would, like, if our classes were in there, we would write a statement as to why we refused to go in this building. And so it really, you know, when we talk about all of the items that are still currently there, when we talk about the bones of our people that are there, that were stolen, black market sold, and when we talk about, you know, that relationship of that higher education had with anthropology, even at the Smithsonian, right? And even one of our own, you know, Francis LaFleche that participated in that. When we look at that harm that was caused intentionally and the role that they played, you know, they got a lot of work to do, heck of a lot of work. And so they have some nerve trying to say that I acknowledge that this was on the land of la, 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 and that we acknowledge that they existed here before. Well, duh, we know they existed here before, you know, and guess what? They're still here. Number two, they're still here. And have you formed a relationship with that group of people? Do you go to that community to do anything but research? Or do you go into that community to extract information and research from those people to fill your little CV, right? To fulfill your own needs? Or do you go into that community to serve those people and to really find out what they need, ask the questions what they want? Or when you look at states that want to do land acknowledgements, but they still continue to dig into the bones of our ancestors, they continue to destroy our sacred sites. How dare you want to acknowledge us as having been there, but you refuse to acknowledge our ties to the land that you are continually destroying and not giving us a place or a seat at the table? How dare you? So I'm not the one, I'm not your person to do that. I am your person to come in and tell you, you know, how you can start dismantling ideas of colonialism and white supremacy. You know, I can do that. I can, but until you start acknowledging those ideas of white supremacy and colonialism, until you accept those ideas of white supremacy and colonialism, I can't even begin to talk to you about doing anything that will benefit Native people, because you have to have a full understanding of what you were never taught. And what many of us had to go to college to be able to articulate, because we grew up hearing it. We grew up hearing our grandmas, grandpas talk about it. We grew up hearing our families talk about it, but I didn't know how to articulate it or really say it until I went to college. And it empowered me to be able to speak how white people understand, right? Use the words that give me credibility, have the degrees that give me credibility, to be able to speak to them in a way that they can understand what happened to us. And so that's my role. Those are some of my gifts. And each of us here have different gifts. Each of us individually as human beings have different gifts. So I'll stop there.
I regret giving Bemis a land acknowledgement. Because I've seen how they've weaponized it, and I've also seen how they've weaponized it against me and continue to use my brownness in support of a program while also not paying me. So I've given them a tool that they can now turn into a weapon or wield irresponsibly. Because Bemis, as I believe we all know, at least when I was there, is run by an all or primarily, like, as a 90% white staff, who are using the land acknowledgement to perform their social responsibility, yet while not actually maybe enacting that responsibility. On the other hand, I also teach Native American art, modern and contemporary, but also ancient, at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And that is a place where I think that it is also useful. So I use the land acknowledgement that was generated by the American Indian Center in Chicago. That land acknowledgement was, I believe, was written by them, but was most recently used in the Chicago Architecture Biennial as a kind of like an architectural manifesto for how that exhibition positioned itself. And I also think that exhibitions and institutions like museums are the spaces in which we most kind of encounter land acknowledgements. I just said that, and then I'm also like, well, maybe that's actually the only places that I go. That might also be true. So in those I also heard a story of an architect coming to the Chicago Architecture Biennial, seeing a land acknowledgement, and then having such a radical re-understanding of space through this land acknowledgement that he began to practice architecture differently. I mean, that is also this kind of like the potential of change that something can do. But I think also building off of what Marisa is saying is, what is the labor that the land acknowledgement performs? And how is it also a stand-in for not asking actual Native people to perform that labor for you? When is that useful? And then when is it also used irresponsibly? Like when can it be used instead of being useful? So I use the land acknowledgement. Today was the first day of class. I said it all day. Because I'm also teaching a Native American art class, and I'm also teaching a class on art and justice, so the art's ability to enact change. And so part of that has to, as like a sort of educational process, is about helping students identify literally where they stand in space and the position that they are afforded socially because of their kind of positionality, but then also their emplacement. So those were two really different kinds of like they're hurtful. I regret it, and then they're also useful. But so I would say it's like contextual.
And it sounds like ultimately you're seeing it as an education opportunity, as a way to reorient. Like that's very profound, being reoriented in a space physically, conceptually, cosmologically, you know, understanding the relationships between land and humans, non-humans.
Yeah, I guess I am seeing it as a tool, and depending on who's using that tool, it could become a weapon. And so I think that, like, at least for the kinds of classes that I'm interested in teaching, the kinds of stories that I'm interested in telling, it has to start by reorienting yourself in relationship, or your student in relationship to the place that they inhabit. And I mean that inhabitation on many different kinds of registers.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like from what Marisa was saying, that we're not like that reorientation, that understanding of white supremacy and how it's built into the foundation of our institutions, governments, you know, that reorienting work sounds like it's what needs to be done first. You know, the acknowledgement is sort of this, like, maybe not an ending statement, maybe we can come up with something better, but it's the hard work that needs to be done. And I just want to say in conclusion, we've run a little bit over, but you three are doing such hard work, and it is so inspiring and so wonderful for all of us to hear from you today, to hear your ideas and experiences. Thank you for sharing that. We have more questions. I want to say to the listeners that this will be posted online. It's going to be transcribed. We can share resources. So if any of you out there want to share resources, we can also share that through Amplify Art's website. And
can I say something, one more thing? There was a question in the questions that was saying, how can we make land acknowledgements non-performative? And I had this kind of imagining, like land acknowledgements are purposely written in this sort of like vague sense of time. There is no Chicago is the homeland, or is the it like belongs to, or the Three Tribes Confederacy rather belongs to this land that is called Chicago. So I'm also wondering how there is this like sort of vagueness of language and the way that it is elliptical in time, that like like as Steve was saying, that puts Native Americans in a sort of extinction past myth. And if they could be recuperated to have a sort of more active reclaiming through language, could a land acknowledgement become a speech act in the way that it is like setting forth a position that makes possible in an imaginary the idea that this land will actually be, I'll just say it, Three Tribes Confederacy, because I'm in Chicago again.
Mm-hmm.
That is a grammatical tool. And I'm wondering if there's any potentiality of that. Sorry to interrupt. Thank you.
No, totally. That's a great thought. I think there completely is. I mean, even hearing the statement of land we currently call Nebraska implies that there is a moment when it won't be called Nebraska. And I really like that. Instead of land that was once Omaha land, like this, we're currently calling it this, but there is this there is this looking to the future for a time when it won't be called that broadly. And I do think,
I just
yeah.
want to touch base really quick on something Steve said that I'd wanted to talk about earlier. When he had talked about during our migrations and things happening, and those were what we call creation stories, right? They might not have been the creation story, but they were creation stories. And so Omaha means the people who went upstream. It refers to a moment in time when the Degiha group of 5 tribes was crossing the Mississippi, and some of us went up, which was to become the Omaha Ponca, because the Ponca and Omaha were still one at that time. And the ones that went down were the Ogakpa, the Wajaje, the Kaw, which are now down in Oklahoma, but we're more, just a little bit southern of where we are now. And so the current changed, so it took them down. So sometimes you'll hear people say against the current, Omaha against the current. That was a creation story. We were not Omaha until that moment in time. We were something else. And that something else makes us relatives, sisters, to those other 4 groups of people. To this day, Omaha Poncas, we speak the same language. And so it's really, what were we before that? And that's my nerdy self. That's what I do research on, is who were we before that? Where were we before that? What were we doing before that? And I think of the Bide-Wakantawa people that live in what they call Bide-Makaska, like this area, right? And who came up, that their creation story, they came up from a lake in this area, right? This is their creation of that group of people. And how important, like how much a part of their spirit and their heart that lake is to them. And so to reclaim a lake, especially in an urban metro area, like that was, formerly called Lake Calhoun, to reclaim that and call it what they called it before all of this pain and trauma happened, is healing. And that is a form of a reparation that I had talked about. Somebody said, like, what leverage do we really have to do reparations? Well, that's something you have to talk about, because if you start listening to Native people tell you what would mean something to them, those types of stories will unfold. And in this case, there was some really amazing Dakota women who led that charge, intelligent, amazing, traditional, articulate, highly educated women. And they really made the rest of us sit there in awe and watch this and say, oh my gosh, this can happen. Like something none of us thought could happen, they did it. And so it opened this doorway to possibilities. And so we don't know what can possibly happen until we start having these discussions, until we start having those really uncomfortable and sometimes painful conversations about white supremacy and the damage that it's done generationally to people. And then what those people say themselves will help heal those wounds. Won't heal it completely, but it'll make us have something to be proud of. And so I just wanted to say that much, because it kind of fed into what we were talking about. And it's just a really beautiful thing. Every time I go to the lake here, I took the kids, told them the story. This is what happened here. This is the space where this happened at. And these women you know, we don't give them enough credit for what they did.
Awesome. I love it. Conversation and possibilities, talking about futures instead of these sort of, you know, what's the most immediate performance. Talk about possibilities. Steve, do you have any closing words? And Risa and Marisa, do you have more things to say?
I can go on forever. Just to add to Marissa's, you know, and understanding the relationships of our northern Ponkas and Omaha people today, you know, and so even themselves, you know, I hear them identify themselves as Oshni, and so Oshni means cold, but I've also heard Ushni. So U and then Shni and then Pa and then Ka, I can totally break that down. And so understanding the Lakota and Dakota dialects, but understanding this language base of similarities that we are related. And so understanding the Daiga, you know, and the Kas and Kanza, you know, and Wajaji, I understand what that truly means, you know. And so once again, you know, our Northern Ponca relatives, if you break it down into Shni, it means that we're not coming back. And so when they separated, that totally makes sense. And Pa to us is a command from a male. Ka means that that male was an elder. And so some older gentleman stood up and said, Echele Oshni, and then they just left. And I was like, this totally makes sense, because how many of our relatives have just left and we never see them again? And so 1750s, give or take, is when they split and divided. And so the similarities are there linguistically. And so it's a beautiful thing. And so I am so happy and honored to be, you know, part of the Omaha community, because my first indigenous cultural bearer teachers were Omaha. And so that's how special that is to me. And that knowledge I carry everywhere, because of how strict they run that Hetunga, that circle, that Chongleshka. And so that's how special that is to me. And so, you know, my research will take me this way and then all of a sudden take me this way. And so just like our conversation this evening. And so I am honored, I'm privileged to be a part of this panel, but just to be amongst our leaders who are our Wians, who all are women. And that's how powerful that is, because for those of you who don't know, the women led the charge at Standing Rock. And that's how beautiful that is. And so, you know, the last thing I want to add is, you know, we never say goodbye. That doesn't exist in our language. We say Toksha Kewa Chiankikte until we meet again, either here on Uchimaka or up as our spirit track takes us. So I'm really happy, Annika. It's always a pleasure to be around you, to hear you, and all of you ladies on here. Pilams, Wiblahan, Pinigagi, muchas gracias. However you want to say that, I want to say thank you. So thanks.
I also just want to say thank you so much. It's been really wonderful listening to Marisa, to Steve. Thank you, Annika, for your big probing questions. Thank you, Peter and Amplify Arts, for hosting us. It's been a real joy and an honor to get to be in conversation with all of you.
Well, thank you. Maybe someday we'll do a round two. I always feel like we just, you know, just get going in the conversation. Yes, thank you, all three of you. Continue to be well, be safe, keep doing the good work that you're doing. You are all very inspiring. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I see that everybody is leaving wonderful comments. So thank you, the three of you, and have a good night.
All right.
Thank you.
Adios.
Uh-huh.
Bye.